In this segment of class, we're going to look at some key concepts and terms that will both come up throughout the class and which I hope you will then adopt and use in your writing assignments, in your understanding of the readings, in your understanding of the class materials, and then hopefully beyond this class you will be able to apply them to the things you experience or witness in life. Okay, so some key concepts that will come up repeatedly in this class related to history are going to be listed here, and this will be related to a discussion post assignment that you will have for this segment of the lecture videos. The first concept that we're going to review is one you've probably heard before. We're looking at entitlement. And there can be lots of ways to use this term, and you may hear it used many ways. Somebody can use it as a criticism, like, oh, you're so entitled. Oh, I can't believe the entitlement, right? You can hear it in terms of like legal matters, maybe like on a car accident, lawyer, commercial, right? You are entitled to this or that. But either way, however someone's using it, what is at core in the concept of entitlement is the idea of deserving, right? So entitlement is what a person deserves, or what a group of people deserves, right? Rightfully deserves. This is a core concept in history. It doesn't seem like it would be, but it is, because a lot of interactions between groups of people, however they turn out, revolve around entitlement. Who is entitled to what? Who deserves what? Who believes they deserve something? Who feels they have a rightful claim, and why? It's something that is woven in and out of history when it comes to who is entitled to what land, to live where, to what rights, right? To citizenship, to access to resources, and depending on different factors, right? Some people throughout history have believe they deserve more than another group of people based on all kinds of things, whether it be race, gender, nationality, religion, geographic location, and so on, right? And so this is at core of so many interactions between especially different groups of people, but even within the same group of people. We can think about this in our society today as an example, right? There's constant questions about who deserves to be here, who deserves what rights, who deserves what jobs, who deserves what resources like housing, healthcare, education, right? And then why. The arguments people make as to why they are more entitled to something than somebody else, why some group of people is not entitled to this or that, right? And it's a constant discussion. And it goes into, especially, when we get into marginalized people, meaning people who are not at the center of society and who do not hold much of the power. You get into questions of really, what do people deserve when they are powerless? Let's say people who are incarcerated, people who are homeless, people who are disabled, right? And sometimes those ideas of entitlement get taken for granted. Well, of course they don't deserve that because this or that, right? And it gets almost to become like a given. And then there has to be people who advocate from the margins for people in the margins of like, well, hold on a second, let's challenge some of those things we take for granted. So entitlement is something that's at the forefront of like debates, discussions, conflicts. It also, though, is so invisible, right? As oftentimes we think we are entitled to something, we don't even question why that is the case. So this is something, as we learn about history, especially American history, we're learning this year or this semester, that question of why did these people think they deserve this? Why was this group of people treated like they don't deserve this? And then you can question how entitlement operates. Now, one thing that often comes out of entitlement in history is conflict, right? When we're talking about conflict can look many different ways, but at core, what conflict is competition or argument. It's competition or argument over incompatible ideas or claims, meaning two or more groups of people or individuals have incompatible ideas, meaning these two ideas cannot exist at the same time. They cannot work out. They cannot exist and stand in peace at the same time, right? So the conflict is that you have things that cannot coexist as they are, right? And there can be claims on things, it can be ideas about how life should be, and so on, right? And this plays out in history in a number of ways. War, argument, protest, rebellion, tension, revenge, retribution. Those are all different things. They look differently, but they are all rooted in a core conflict, right? War is two sides maybe having different incompatible ideas of claims. We say the border is here. No, we say the border is here. We say we control the water rights to that place. No, we control the water rights. You can't have it both ways, right? Unless you go on to the next concept, which we also see a lot in history, and that is negotiation. So you have two groups of people, two or more groups of people saying incompatible things. They're in conflict. They both want something that cannot exist with the other. If you're not going to allow the conflict to continue into war, into rebellion, into revolution, and you want to instead allow for both claims to continue to exist, you have to then go to negotiation. So negotiation is when you discuss or deal with the conflict in order to come to agreement. And usually in a negotiation, neither side gets exactly what they want, right? We end up with a compromise where each side has to give up a little bit of what they originally had demanded or claimed in order for peace to exist, right? So it's the idea of valuing coexistence and peace over getting your way, right? Which, is not easy. So negotiation can be, which is what people usually think of it as is something within business or politics, right? It's like two different entities within business have to negotiate a deal. Okay, so I'm going to sell you this product at this amount. And the other side says, no, I wanted it in this, I wanted to buy your product for this amount. And now we haggle or negotiate back and forth until you come to a deal that each side can live with. Or in politics, right? Like, negotiating over land claims, trade policies, treaties of, like I said earlier, what can lead to conflict, which has led to conflict. Competing ideas about where borders are, who has land claims, where people can put their ships, where military bases are going to be, who has access to what resources, what the policies over immigration or trade are going to be. They can be negotiated, and they are every day, right? Now, these are things, those are kinds of negotiations that people are used to talking about in history, right? Oh, the treaty of this year, or this land war was avoided by, this policy or whatever, right? So negotiating as a way to avoid conflict between nations, between groups of people. But you can also have negotiation on a cultural level. So you can think about people negotiate every day. Every day, you yourself do it, everybody does it. You negotiate between what you feel inside and what is expected of you on the outside. Your boss expects you to be at work at a certain time, but you don't want to get out of bed. And so in your mind, you are negotiating. How many times can I hit the snooze button, right? So that kind of negotiation happens on a regular basis. But then you step outside of yourself. There are cultural demands. And so the boss expecting you to be on time is kind of a cultural demand if your culture demands and expects promptness, right? So you can say also, though, let's say culturally, in history, one group of people conquers another. The group of people that are being conquered are now having a new system imposed on them, but they still have their old beliefs. Let's say, for example, a good example of this is, let's say, the Aztec Empire, or the Aztecs and the indigenous people of Mexico, right? When the Spanish came and conquered, the conquistadors arrived with Hernan Cortez to conquer the Aztec Empire. Very quickly, as the empire fell, Spanish rule imposed the Spanish language, the Spanish monarchy and legal system, and the Spanish religion, the Catholic religion, Catholicism, onto the indigenous people of Mexico. And so the indigenous people of Mexico had to negotiate, okay, so they're saying that we have to give up these ceremonies, we have to give up our belief in this God or that God, and we have to start going to their churches, and we have to start, praying the way they say to pray. But people don't just switch like a light switch in terms of their beliefs, right? Things that are ingrained in them, things that they value, their core belief system. And so what many indigenous people in Mexico did is to negotiate, to incorporate some of their prior beliefs and, iconography, their gods and so on, into the new religion of Catholicism. And one way we can very clearly see that is the Virgen, right? The Virgin Mary of Guadalupe that comes out of Mexico, right? And we see this in a lot of different countries, that many different places have their own version of the Virgin Mary that reflects what the people there look like, right? That ties to some prior indigenous belief. That would be a cultural negotiation. You got two conflicting things that are being imposed on you, or that coexist, and then you work them together so that they can remain. All right. Sometimes when there are competing claims, or sometimes when there is something being forced upon a person or a group of people, you then, instead of negotiation, have resistance, right? You say, when we're talking about resistance, we're talking about an act of opposition. You're going against it. No, I'm not going to accept this. And that, of course, comes out of conflict, right? And so if conflict arises in terms of what is being imposed on a people, then you may have the actions of resistance, right? So the conflict is the incompatible beliefs, right? And then the actions can be acts of resistance. So you're going against something that's being forced upon you. And usually when we're talking about resistance, we're talking about imbalance of power. The folks who are doing the act of resistance are usually the least or the less powerful group of people. And the more powerful group of people is enforcing something on them. And so to resist is to push back, right? Like if someone's trying to rob you with a gun and you don't have a gun, they are more powerful than you. And so if you fight and kick and, gouge out their eyes, then you are resisting from a less powerful position. You're opposing the force that's being put on you. So some forms of resistance we see in history are rebellions, raids, breaking the law, refusing to conform or accept. So in the example that I just gave of cultural negotiation, some acts of resistance among indigenous people in Mexico was to secretly continue their prior religious worship, right? Even though it was against the law, against Spanish colonial law. So you're breaking the law, you're refusing to accept something is an act of resistance. Gathering people together to rebel against something that's being imposed on people is an act of resistance. Okay. Another term we're going to see, especially in this segment of U.S. history, is paternalism. And so paternalism is the attitude or actions of a person or organization, like a government, that seeks or claims to protect people and give them what they need, which doesn't sound bad, except the other part of paternalism. So, hey, our government wants to take care of you. We're here to protect you, which is usually what a government does, using their military and their laws, right? And give you what you need, right? Like, we have like socialism light in the United States where, you get Social Security if if you are disabled or elderly, or the government gives you access to education, access to education, for example, or street lights that keep you safe, right? So this is a government acting in a protective manner. But the paternalistic government gives people what they need, but does not give the people responsibility or freedom of choice. So it's a government not letting the people vote on what they want. It is the government saying, we as the government, let's say a king or a dictator or an emperor, know what's best for you. And we are doing this only because we care about you, right? So the paternalism, the root word of paternal is pater, like father in Latin, right? Like padre, right? It's the idea of taking care of people but not giving them choice. Lastly, we have intersectionality. This is ways of seeing the differences within a person or a group of people based on different identities, positions of privilege, situations of oppression. So, by viewing things through a lens of intersectionality, you're seeing that one group of people, or even an individual person, can have multiple identities, which in some points give you power and in other points make you oppressed or powerless, right? So for example, if a person is a black man who is disabled and has U.S. citizenship. Okay, let's say that that's a person. Multiple labels, multiple identities, but we can look at in that one person, those identities intersect. So in some cases, that man will be powerful because he is a man in our society, right? Men historically and live in the legacy of power, right? Of being given access to power and being imbued with power. At the same time, he's black, which in our society has a legacy of being disempowered, of being marginalized and oppressed. This man is disabled, which leaves him out of the mainstream and denies him access to many resources that non-disabled people have access to. But he's a U.S. citizen, which gives him privileges and powers that someone who's undocumented doesn't have, right? And so we can look at an individual, you can look at the ways that they've moved, so we're going through history, ways that people have moved and interacted. It's not one thing or another. People are complex creatures and society is very complex. And in the same turn, a person can have power and then be powerless, depending on where they stand in relation to others. The same thing can be true with a group of people, right? And so when we're looking at history, we want to look at things through an intersectional lens, where we consider the different ways that people move through the world, right? And so as we're studying history, we can say, oh, well, this person was an enslaved person. They're powerless. Well, they also knew how to read, and they were allowed by their enslaver to keep a portion of their pay. And so with that, they had more power than somebody else in a similar situation, right? So looking at where are the ways that people had power and were able to use their agency and which ways they were not. Okay. All right. So that takes us to the first question for this discussion post assignment. And this is discussion post number 2. It says 3 questions in total. I apologize. It's actually 2 questions in total. Let me fix that. There you go. The magic of technology. There's 2 questions in total. You're going to choose any of the concepts, 2 of any of the key concepts that I mentioned just before this, either entitlement, conflict, negotiation, resistance, paternalism, or intersectionality, and describe a specific instance or example of each where you can see them in your life or in the current world. Okay, so think about where you can see an example of entitlement, conflict, negotiation, resistance, paternalism, intersectionality in the news, in your own life, in an event that's happened around you or in your lifetime, right? Something that would be representative of that. And you're doing this to demonstrate you understand the concept, right? So really, you can't really explain things and you can't really find an example of things unless you understand it. So this is an exercising and really kind of thinking deeply of where you can see how this has played out. And so you're going to go to the discussion post number 2, and this is one of 2 questions. Choose 2 concepts to describe. Okay, so we're going to deep dive into a concept that not only applies, of course, to history, just like all the other concepts, but to our current world, and that hopefully you can bring with you into your own understanding of yourself, your world, the history that you're going to learn, and anything else that you learn in the future. So what we're going to be looking at is something called social constructs. Social constructs are, I encourage you to question things, not just for the sake of questioning, but to gain broader understanding. But I especially encourage you to question within yourself, right, and within, your studies, those things that are often taken for granted. Again, things that we've just accepted as fact or truth. And a lot of times the things that we have accepted as fact or truth are actually not. They are what we call social constructs. And what a social construct is, or what social constructs are beliefs that are built by and into a society that create a sense of what is normal. And they provide a society guidelines on how to operate. So these are things that have been constructed in a society, which means that they can change from society to society, right? There are things that a given society can come up with in order to organize their society, in order to explain things in their society, and in order to create kind of guidance or directions or instructions on how to move within that society. Again, they are not fact, except within the society you're in. Okay? So, one way we're going to look at social constructs has to do with making meaning. Okay? So, we know that there is human difference. There are differences in the way people look, act, live, believe, and so on. There's differences in what different people desire, differences in the way that people act. But how do we make meaning of these is a social construct. So the fact is, some people are tall, some people are short, some people are light skinned, some people are dark skinned, some people have long hair, some people have short hair, right? These are facts. The thing that is not a fact is what those things mean to us. And those are created by our society. So social constructs are how we construct meaning. And then we attach those meanings to differences, desires, and actions. Okay, so let me give you some examples to make this clearer. Okay. So let's take something that is a human difference. Earlobes. Okay. I think in general there are two types of earlobes that human beings have, right? They can either be detached or attached. So here on the left is a detached earlobe, the little part where you kind of like get an ear piercing, the lobe. In detached earlobes is not stuck to the side of your face. It hangs free. The earlobe on the right is an attached earlobe. The earlobe does not hang free, it's attached to the side of the head. Okay? That's a factual difference. Genetically, some people have detached earlobes and some people have attached earlobes. In our society, we don't attach meaning to different earlobes. We don't say, oh, people with detached earlobes are so much more intelligent than people with attached earlobes. Or we don't say, people with attached earlobes are so much more beautiful, right? Attached earlobes are so much more beautiful than detached. We don't have that. We have not constructed any social meaning related to this human difference. However, there are other things that are just as arbitrarily, genetically just different in people that our society has chosen to put meaning to. Hair color. Hair grows out of people's heads. Whatever color, genetically, it will grow out of your head, right? But we have attached meaning to that. Oh, well, blonde people are blah, 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 blah. Oh, well, black hair is da-da-da-da-da, right? It's no different than earlobes in the sense that it is a factual difference that is based on genetics and it just happens. Red hair people are gingers or da-da-da, right? That we attach those meanings to. Okay. Same thing with eye color. Genetically, people just have different eye color. But we attach meaning including beauty, attractiveness, desirability, to that eye color. It's just the color. Your eyes are just, that's how they're forming in your head. There's nothing, that you've done to make that eye color. You're not more skillful. You haven't put in more effort, but yet people will compliment people on their eye color. Wow, your blue eyes are beautiful, right? Wow, I wish I had blue eyes. It becomes an issue of desirability. It becomes an issue of elevating a person because of their eye color. And of course, both hair color and eye color, it's not something you can detach from the larger social constructs of, let's say, white supremacy, right? The hyper valuing of those genetic qualities that are aligned with people from Europe, people who are categorized as white, right? Whether it be light skin, right? Skin color is a huge one too, right? We have, especially in the last 600 years on Earth, 500 years on Earth, because of the colonialism that has come through European conquest of the world, right? And of course, as it being Europeans who have conquered the world through colonialism and imperialism, it has been their genetic qualities that they have elevated. So you wouldn't, so eye color, like when people have prettiest eyes in the yearbook in high school, hands down, it's over and over again, the people with what we would call colored eyes, right? Like blue eyes, green eyes. We subconsciously have internalized that idea that those are superior eye colors, right? But again, you wouldn't have prettiest earlobes. Oh, the detached earlobes are so much better. I'm going to get surgery. I'm going to, alter my earlobes so that they can be like these earlobes that are better. But people do it with hair color, eye color, skin color. Same thing is true with height, right? And this is also gendered and racialized. Right? We take something that is just something you cannot fix. It is genetic. It has no meaning. It's arbitrary. It's not, one is not, not better than the other until we make that meaning. And then we put it into media, right? We put it into, people then absorb it from, and media, can go back into the day, into fairy tales and into artwork and into, those are all mediums at which we, that we receive information through. And we get that implanted. No one is directly telling you this is good or this is bad, or sometimes they are, but usually not. Instead, you're just seeing who gets represented, who gets treated as handsome or beautiful, or what is considered desirable in movies and TV and magazines and stories. What does Prince Charming look like? What does the princess look like? When we get those messages over and over and over again, it shapes how we view these otherwise arbitrary and meaningless things like height, skin color, eye color, hair color, right? And those are social constructs. They have been constructed by our society to make us believe, that this is beautiful. Yeah, it's normal to think this is beautiful, and it's normal to think this is ugly. And then we have all industries that help people move away from what our society has deemed ugly into what is attractive. And again, I said height is gendered and racialized, right? And so again, many people of the world genetically typically are on the shorter end. And then whether you are a man or a woman, that has been then described as attractive or unattractive, right? Very, very tall women can be attractive if they fall into other categories, let's say thin, light skin, right? Then it's different if a person is not thin and if they are darker skinned and they are a woman and they have height. They get read in different ways, and it's this whole web of social constructs that we don't even consciously think about. Things like body parts, and this changes over time, right? It can be things like breast size. It can be things like, the size of, your bottom. It can be waist size. It can be things, and they're very gendered as well, right? It can be, how big your shoulders are. It can be how big your hips are. Body parts. And this, again, is not static. Oh yeah, everyone thinks that's attractive. No, because if you study history, you go back in time, you can see in different societies, in different points of time, something that we find attractive today was the opposite in the past, right? So these things are fluid, meaning they're always changing, which means they are not fact, which means they are social constructs. They have been constructed and created in a society, right? The way people move, Like how someone walks, we read how someone walks. Oh, they're a gangster. Oh, are they disabled? Or and then we attach meaning to that, right? And the meaning sometimes is how valuable that person is. The way someone talks, their accent, the slang they use, right? Those are natural things. They are fluid, but they are natural things for people to develop different ways of speaking based on where they are from and their social context, right? What social class you're in, right? What occupation you're in, what kind of education you got, right? These things impact people's speech, but then we can just say, oh yeah, people speak differently from place to place. But then we add meaning to that, whether we think somebody is high class, low class, educated, not educated, safe or danger, whatever it is, we attach meaning to it. So the social construct is the meaning we put to things that are just normal human things. Then we can expand that out into even things that are not genetic, like speech, right? Into things that are not even human, but things that we interact with. So for example, food. There are social constructs around food, right? Something as just nourishment for your body. We add value to certain types of food, foods that come from certain places and people, right? What is considered fancy cuisine? French food? Why? I've never really had any French food that has ever trumped any kind of, Mexican food, Japanese food, Chinese food that I've ever had. Yet, what is considered fine cuisine? It's changed in recent years, but that's still there, right? If the food fills you up and nourishes you, that alone is not enough for us to judge it. There are also larger meanings around food, right? And then eating, how much you eat, how you eat. We attach meanings. Oh, look, they are like this, that, and the other, because look at the way that they eat. Look at what they're eating, right? We associate something with eating fast food. We associate, and it's not just about, let's say health, because even health is a loaded thing, right? But, what we think of the person, what we assume about a person when they're eating, sushi versus, flaming hot Cheetos, right? Like we can just say like, well, this is not good for you, or that is good for you, or whatever. But that's not really the point. The point is what we can then assume we know about the people who are eating this or that. It goes into things like hair length, your hairstyle. We try to read people based on these social constructs. Read whether they are a person that deserves respect or not, which is messed up, but that's real, right? Whether they are a danger to us or not. Whether they are someone who deserves a job or not, right? What language people speak in, and then with that, right, which languages people have a larger grasp of, and which languages people may struggle in. People will associate intelligence to that. People will associate respectability to that. People will associate ability to that, right? Beliefs and relations, like the way that people organize their family, the beliefs that they carry. We then put value judgments on people. All of it is made up. The beliefs and the ideas of relationships are already made up, right? Marriage is a social construct. It doesn't just naturally happen, right? It comes through the religious beliefs and government beliefs, right? We construct that and we can change it however we want, right? Polygamy is allowed in some places, and in other places it's not allowed. You're not allowed to marry more than one person. Gender in marriage, right? Gender in relationships is all made up because we can look through history and see it has been different in different places in the world at different time periods. And all it takes is for everybody in that society, or the majority of people in a society, to agree, yeah, this is right, or this is normal, this is how we're going to do it. And then it's constructed. A huge social construct that we're going to talk about a lot in this class is race. Race is a social construct, okay? And this is something that people oftentimes find difficult to understand because all right, so we can see race as a social construct even though it's based on genetic differences, just like we talked about earlobes, hair color, eye color, skin color, and so on. race, even though it's based on the idea that there are biological differences, the way we categorize people based on those differences, the way we then assign meaning to those differences, even creating the idea that there are separate definable categories of people based on these biological, physical differences like skin color, hair color, nose feature, or nose shape, eye shape, other facial features, makes it a social construct. There are no biological races, right? There is no genetic code, there is no specific gene to make a person Asian or black or white, right? There's no Native American gene. Like, you don't have a gene. You have genes for various physical features, and then we as a society categorize people with those physical features, plus we add in there where people come from and all the other things like how they talk and language and all that stuff to create this construct of a race. We can also see that this idea of race as we know it today has not always existed in human societies, in human understanding of other humans and themselves. So where does this idea of race come from? So we can look at race as a creation of human categorization. It's a very human thing to want to organize information that we receive, categorize and label things and people around us as a means of trying to understand life in society, right? Is that we group certain animals together, group certain plants together, we group certain types of geographical formations together to help us organize information. We group events to try and understand and organize time in our minds. We're trying to take things that are intangible or overwhelming or incomprehensible and use our little puny human minds to put them together in a way that we can make peace with it and understand it and navigate it. And race is no different, right? It is a tool that we use to understand how the world around us works. Well, our current perceptions of race, it's not that people have not noticed that there's differences between people from different places. That's obvious, right? And people have described throughout history in writings people from different places in different ways. So, for example, you can take like pre-European arrival Native Americans, right? So indigenous people in the Americas. Before Europeans arrived, indigenous people separated themselves from each other, right? And even some of the names that we have, incorrect names that we use for different Native American nations, let's say like the Sioux or the Nez Perce, or those are names that are not the names that the people themselves call themselves. They are names that were imposed upon them. And a lot of times what happens is when Europeans arrive, they would ask a group of people, who are the people who live over there? And they would say, oh, those are the, I don't know, whatever, Sioux. But then perhaps that word means those other people in that language. So it's like people have been able to separate themselves from each other into, tribes or nations or races as a way to organize our understanding of us and them, or this difference that we have versus their difference they have. But our modern conceptions of race very much grow up and are created alongside European colonization over the last 600 years. Now, the world as we know it today, of course, has not always existed, whether it be the nations, the religions, the categorizations of people. It only existed a very short time in the long span of human history, and it's hard to believe that, but that's one of the benefits of learning history, is that this too will fall away. The way we have created the world will not always exist, right? And so humans remake the world for themselves over and over again throughout time. So in the last 600 years here on Earth, much of our existence and the reality that many people have lived in have been shaped by European colonization. And if we go back in time, right, because of the lack of technology and migration and interaction, that hasn't, life for people has been shaped by other forces, right? But in the last 600 years, it's European colonization that has really shaped the way we understand the world and the way we live today. So as Europeans went out and colonized the world, they're encountering different forms of people, but they're not encountering different kinds of people on a level of wanting to just interact or know about each other or trade with each other even. European colonization and European migration out into the world has been within the structure of colonization, which is conquest. And so as Europeans arrive in new places, there is a desire to create categories of inequality as a way to justify taking over another person's land. How can you justify arriving at someone else's home and saying they don't deserve to live there and you do? That they owe you payments from their labor. How do you just justify that? Well, one tool of justification was religion. Another tool of justification was race. And so in conquering other groups of people, the decrees set out by European kings and queens, right, is tied to the church and tied to race. That these people are heathens, and therefore we are superior with our religion, and we have a right to then Christianize them. These people are primitive. They are lower than us because look at their race and the way they live. We have a right to colonize them. And in order to kind of solidify this and make it real, it gets codified, which means it gets put into law. And we can look over the past 600 years how many laws have been created through European colonial systems that have to do with this concept of race. And at first it's kind of murky and they're not really sure about the terminology and who is who. And because, people of different quote unquote races can have children together. And then it creates almost like new groups of people and how are we going to categorize them? But it's always done in the effort to create what's called a hierarchy, meaning a social order of who's at the top, who's in the middle, and who's at the bottom. And based on that hierarchy or that ladder, then you get to decide the entitlement of different people. Well, people at the top have the right to own land and run for office, and people at the bottom, and so then you can decide who gets what, who is deserving of what based on race. And that has overwhelmingly shaped the world and still is something that we're wrangling with. And to make it more kind of valid or just, and therefore unquestionable, social constructs then get put into law. But then also, it just happens that over the last 600 years, and especially in the last 200 years, you have a movement towards using science as a way to validify things, to make them real. And so there is no real science behind race. And so a pseudoscience, pseudo meaning fake, right? So a fake science, a fake kind of realm of study gets developed around race. And you had, with the development of modern science, and then with industrialization, things becoming about machinery and data and mechanization and metrics, using those new tools of modern science and industrialization, taking an old concept of trying to colonize people based on their genetic differences. All these things meld together, and this fake science of racial classification develops, especially in the United States. It becomes very strong, but all throughout Europe as well, right? And what grows out of this fake science is a realm called eugenics. As the idea of genes, right, genetics, as Charles Darwin begins to write about evolution, and scientists began to study genes and how genes can make, you probably learned this in school, right, of Mendel's genetics, and the peas, some peas have wrinkly skin, some peas have smooth skin, and understanding genetics and breeding and all that. People began to apply the idea of genetics to these social constructs of race, right? And eugenics grows out of that, where these scientists began to try to mess with human breeding in order to push forward, really wrap white supremacy into it, the idea of a kind of a master race of people, a race of people who can eliminate all the negative genetics. And so if you're already thinking about this from a white supremacist viewpoint, what negative genetics are would be then the things that are not associated with Europeans, right? And so eugenics became a realm of study that then became policies like forced sterilization, right? Taking people who are considered groups of people with not good genetics and then sterilizing them, meaning not allowing them to have children, right? Like giving them, hysterectomies or whatever to not have children. Eugenics develops in the United States, pulling together this social construct of race with science and then turning it into policy or actions of the government. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party would borrow a lot of American eugenics beliefs and then put them into play in terms of eventually what was the Holocaust, really, and Nazi Germany policies. So from this pseudoscience of racial classification, instead of just saying like, oh, somebody's dark skin or light skin or people come from this place or that place, to try and make it scientific the way you would classify plants into like genus and phylum and animals into, family and whatever. Try to do that with races. And so these scientists came up with these 3 racial categories: Caucasoid, of people originating in Europe; Negroid, originating from Africa; and Mongoloid, originating from Asia. Well, of course, that doesn't cover all of the continents. And so the idea was, in order to justify Europeans taking over North and South America, where Native Americans lived, the theory that those people actually migrated from Asia and they're actually Mongoloids was useful in justifying, well, those people came here and then we came here and it's just a matter of time before we take over their land, which is not really their land because they migrated from Asia. So it's all of this storytelling in the effort to push forward European colonization and justify it. So from the Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid categories, right, we then simplify that down into these very static, color-coded categories: white, black, yellow, red, brown, to match what was really happening on the ground, right? And you have this kind of creation of this brown category, which we would then label like Latino, Hispanic, Latin American later on. But really, that's not a race in this classification. We're talking about simplifying down something that is so complex. Throughout Latin America, throughout North and South America, you have people from all different parts of the world that have come together through colonialism. You have, let's say in Latin America, you have black people, you have Asian people, you have white people, you have, and they can all be under this umbrella of Latin American or Latino. But that's where we can see how much this is a social construct, that this is not really a thing other than what we've created. But to try to make it a thing, this is like that's fact and fact-based, this fake science was developed. And so people, these race scientists, they'd be called, would do things like try to measure the average skull sizes of different groups and make the argument that the cranium size and the cranium shape meant that Europeans were superior, and that at the bottom of the scale were African peoples who were most inferior and closest to animals, right? They would go around the world and do studies on people's nose sizes and, the space between their eyes and the flatness of their face, or, the position of their ears. Like we go back to what we started with. Earlobes. They're arbitrary. This is all arbitrary. Just human difference. But now you are trying to construct it to make meaning. And it's kind of gathering evidence and working towards a hypothesis you've already deemed true. Backward science. So the other things that we're talking about, like race, are not quote-unquote real, right? They're not like fact they're not set in stone, they are still real, right? Because these social constructs create meaning in our lives, and therefore it shapes the actions that we take, the actions the government takes, the actions that other people take, the actions that institutions take, and it creates meaningful results in our reality, right? So based on the social construct of marriage, laws are created about, property, about rights, about, residency. Like, these are real things that affect people's lives, even if it's based on a social construct. So even though race is a social construct, it shapes the way we view other people, and then the way we view other people as, what, are they a threat? Are they safe? Right? Are they smart? Are they stupid? Are they capable or are they incapable? And these are so ingrained in us that we don't even think about it. And so people will say, well, I'm not racist, or I'm not bigoted. And that may be the case, you may not consciously be. But we have absorbed all of these meanings our whole lives, just like if we go back to the beginning of this lecture, to our ideas about what is a nice eye color, hair color, what is an attractive person, what is a desirable feature. Where did those ideas come from is the question you need to ask yourself if you care to understand why you do what you do and how the society is operating. Okay? So, when we're talking about race as a social construct, right, we have to understand that as a social construct, it is different from place to place. So the way race operates in the United States cannot directly be applied in other places necessarily. There may be some overlap, but it's not exactly the same because the U.S. developed in a specific way with specific groups of immigrants, with specific histories of how the government interacted with different groups, with specific ways our media and religious institutions operated, and so on. So if you go to, let's say, Latin America, even in different parts of Latin America, based on who are the indigenous groups there, which European country took over, it's different from Brazil, as different from Cuba, is different from Mexico, is different from Jamaica, right? And these are all like places in the Americas that all faced European colonization, that all had indigenous populations, that all saw African people brought as slaves, right? But they operated differently based on the context on the ground. And so race developed differently in those places. And again, there may be overlap, right? There's anti-blackness in all of these places. There's a history of African slavery in all these places. There's a history of indigenous people having their lands appropriated and being displaced in all of these places. But the specifics of how it happened then create a different kind of racial dynamic. And then if we go outside of the Americas, right, and we go to, let's say, a place like, let's go to Asia, right? Race also operates differently based on histories of colonization and whether places were colonized by Europeans or colonized by other Asian nations, right? The way race operates in Japan is very different than the way race operates in India, even though they're both Asian countries, right? And it's going to be very different than the way race operates in the US. So we have to also think about, here race is very important, but in other places the same kind of categorization can happen around ethnicity. So for example, Japan colonized Korea. And so even today, there are Koreans who live in Japan and who may be third, fourth, fifth generation born in Japan. But because they have Korean heritage, people with Korean heritage do not have the same rights as people who are ethnically Japanese, even today. It's something similar to, let's say, here in the United States, right? Mexican Americans can be fourth generation born in the U.S., third generation born in the U.S., and yet because of the history of how race and ethnicity have operated in the U.S., there's going to continuously be the sense that Mexican Americans are not like normal Americans, regular Americans, right? Because a regular American has been so ingrained in everybody as being white Americans, people who have ancestors from Europe, right? So race and ethnicity, they kind of, meld together into creating these social constructs, but they're different from place to place. Religion can also be something that has been used to categorize people along the same lines as race has been used in the U.S., right? So in countries where you have large groups of people that are both, let's say, Muslim and Christian. You may, depending on which kind of government they have, are they having a Christian government? Are they having a Muslim government? Or, which group is going to be treated as having more entitlement than the other? So, currently we're talking about, for example, Israel and Palestine. It's the same thing. We can look at it along the same lines as how we have racially categorized people in the United States. But it's along different lines. It's a different kind of makeup but it's a social construct, right? You can have, for example, Israeli people who look like Palestinian people, and it's not a clear marker between the two, but that doesn't matter. There are different ways of organizing people, but with the same outcome. Is that this is a social construct where some people are given more rights than others. We've created the meaning that because you are of this group or that group, then whatever, right? Whatever outcome we decide. We also have history and class identification. So, for example, Britain colonized Ireland, right? And Irish people and British people are both white people, and you can't really look at people and tell whether they are British or Irish, right? But because of the history of colonization and because of creation of different classes of people, and we can tie religion into that as well, and even ethnicity, right? There is a stratification or a differentiation between groups of people. And then as a result, they are given the meaning of that they are less able, or that they are less deserving, or that whatever, right? So like I said, even though they can be different from place to place, there can still be, because the world has been colonized in the past 600 years by essentially the same forces, we can see that there are legacies or things that continue on from colonialism that worldwide impact groups of people. Anti-blackness is one of those, right? Because colonialism, European colonialism, was tied to the African slave trade very closely. Anywhere that colonialism happened, right, you can usually see that there, or in the Americas, let's say, anywhere in the Americas that was colonized, which is everywhere, African slaves were brought in as an exploitable labor force. And in order to justify people being robbed of their right to freedom, right, you have the perpetuation of anti-blackness. And that then, even as we end slavery in the world, it then gets transferred into representations of people, media, laws, so on, that perpetuate this idea that black people are inferior. That concept is worldwide today, and it has been made worldwide by our globalization, and as businesses get connected and media gets transferred, it's in the movies, it's in the music, it's in the representations in magazines and so on, and now with the internet, even more so. And the flip side of that, of course, is white supremacy. And so, whole industries of skin lighteners and plastic surgeries and Hollywood with consistently centering whiteness as akin to humanness, right? Main characters often being white characters, right? And it's who gets represented, who gets humanized, who gets uplifted as a kind of a supreme image of what everyone wants to attain. And then if you have blackness on one end and whiteness on, and these are all constructs, right? These are all made up, but with very real consequences. Then you have people that are neither white nor black, or don't identify as either of those groups, kind of in the middle. And so you have, as if white is presented as supreme, then there is a desire to get closer to whiteness in order to access the safety and privileges that come with being white. And that can be with, come through in the ways of who people encourage to get married to within a family, what people get encouraged to look like, who people are encouraged to go work for and talk like and dress like and act like, and, it comes out in so many ways, whether it be parents telling their kids to stay out of the sun, or telling, kids well, I don't want you to marry this group or that group, or I encourage you to marry this group. It can be the idea of bettering the race. It can be an idea of what is a respectable way to dress or talk. All of this is related to these social constructs related to race. And if we start to question, why do I like this? Or is this really just a preference? Where did I get this preference from? Where did I get this idea from? Who do I respect and who do I not respect? Who do I think of as like me and not like me? You'll start to see these social constructs, and you'll start to question, all the ways that they were internalized in you and then dictate how you act in the world. All right, that takes us to our second question for discussion post number 2. Based on what you've just heard in this lecture, what is a social construct? And I want you to write this in your own words. And what I mean by that is just describe it as if you were trying to explain it to your friend, right? Or your parents or your grandma. It doesn't have to sound professional. It doesn't have to have the terms that I used, but just basically try to explain like what that is. Think of yourself trying to explain this to your child or to a younger brother or sister or your grandma or someone who's never heard of these things and maybe doesn't have these concepts. How would you explain a social construct? Then give one example of a social construct from this video that I mentioned, and then try and think of an example that was not mentioned explicitly in the video, but that you can see in your life or in the world. And if it's something that I kind of mentioned in the video, but you see it in your life, then just expand upon it and give a more personal interpretation of how you see this represented in your life or in the world around you.